Right, let's go. Okay, so today there's a timetable that we will try roughly to stick to, although we're already a bit over the edge. So Grant and I will begin by having a conversation about some of the things that we got from our most recent visit to Shantiniketan, and talk a little bit about what we saw and where we went and who we talked to. So we'll begin with that. Then Anjali will talk, Anjali and Kojo will talk about some of the ways they're thinking about Tagore in relationship to a new project they're developing. Then we'll have, it says lunch here, but I think it'll probably be like tea or coffee. We'll have a break and go downstairs and have a short break. I think it will be shorter than the hour that is optimistically proposed on this website.
In advance, do you think?
Like,
so, yeah.
Do you think we should?
We could.
I think we'll be all right.
Might be.
It's just if we think about food now, then it'll take
I mean, like,
half an hour.
yeah, okay.
Sorry, should have thought about it before. But we can always nip out and get stuff as well, sure.
No, there are many places.
Exactly, you're just going to nip and get something and bring it back. Then after that moment where we find some food, Vendolin will be talking about some of the research that she's been doing and connecting it to the ideas that that she's developing at the moment. Then afterwards we'll be playing some sound files from Anshuman Dasgupta, who's not with us but is part of the research network. We spent a lot of time with him in Shantiniketan. Carla is going to be presenting him, as it were. Carla's going to be ghosting Anshuman. And then we're going to end with Adrian reading. Yeah?
Yes, it's just, I just highlighted, it's quite short, it's just every time the word Tagore crops up in Vikram sets a suitable body, it's to do with the name Tagore in other enunciations.
Great. That's fantastic. It's wonderful. So to begin, just to open up the conversations and to remind those people that are part of the network of the kind of things that we've been trying to discuss, but also to introduce some of the ideas to those people that are joining us for the first time in a way, or have different relationships to the material. So the Tagore Pedagogy and Visual Cultures Research Network was set up in dialogue between Grant and myself, really to think through, not to bring together a group of experts on Tagore. I think we've all established fairly clearly now that none of us really know, none of us could be described as experts on Tagore. We have some people in the research group, like Rustam Baruka, who we will be talking about a little bit in a minute, who is an expert on Tagore in the sense that he knows the material much better. Anshuman is running the Tagore Centre, so has a different entry into it. But all of us have our suspicions and our concerns around the hagiographic, the term that came up yesterday, hagiographic, but also reified position that Tagore holds, not just within an Indian cultural context and a Bengali cultural context, but also within a global context. Obviously, Tagore is a figure who was very quickly taken up by the West as a figure that exemplified firstly a kind of nationalism, then a universalism. And Tagore himself, in much of his writing, in his poetry and in his lectures, and also in his novels, talks a lot about universal and spiritual ideas of cosmopolitanism and humanism. The term he uses quite often is universal humanism. Terms that, in a contemporary context, within the field of visual cultures, academically, but more broadly within the field of curating and artistic production, are terms that are uncomfortable and are difficult to use. So in a way, the exercise of moving towards Tagore, or utilising what Tagore stood for, in a sense, and utilising his image, his plays, and utilising the way in which he stood for a certain type of spiritual thinking, the political, is the task that we're trying to develop within this research group. But we're not looking to kind of find an answer to questions, and we're not looking to develop a kind of a retort, if it were, to the kind of Tagorean position, or to interpret Tagore within a contemporary context for art and curating. Those things aren't interesting to us. Rather, we're moving through Tagore to find to begin to develop questions that, that Grant and I posed at the beginning, and I think have become much more complex and interesting through our discussions with you guys and the people we've met along the way, which are principally to do with, first of all, the idea of the image and the way in which the image and poetics, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about poetry as it came up in our discussions at Shanton and Caton, might be understood as forms that displace or rethink a certain approach to the political. Secondly, through the concept of cosmopolitanism. What does it mean now? We talked a lot with Rustam Baruka about a turn away from using the term cosmopolitanism within political discourses, post-colonial discourses. And we're now thinking about how to think it on the basis of, and I guess this is the third point, and this is something that's particularly, I think particularly of concern to Grant and I and many people here, how we might rethink the position of artistic institutions, by which I mean institutions that are run by and for and in collaboration with artists and their discourses and the way they produce ideas and images. How can we rethink the cosmopolitan institution, given that largely many of the institutions that now have set themselves up to be that are failing in many ways? So these are the kind of questions. So in a way, Tagore is our I guess our nexus, or even that's not quite right. Tagore is the way in which we work through Tagore towards the idea of social organisation and its relationship to art, using the location Shanton and Caton, which was set up by Tagore in the early 20th century, as a locus of new thinking about pedagogy and social learning, to rethink where we are now with those ideas and how arts institutions and the organisation of art might contribute differently than the way it is now to those important ideas. So that's kind of where we are, I think. Just to tell you, kind of on a practical basis, the research network is meeting 4 times. This is the 3rd meeting. The first meeting happened in November, here at Innova. The second meeting happened at Shanton and Caton, Calcutta and Shanton and Caton in February. This is the 3rd meeting, and the 4th meeting will be happening as part of an exhibition that is being produced at NGBK in an opening in 2 weeks' time, and we're going in about a month's time. And we're going to be talking in much more detail about the content and form of that exhibition tomorrow. In fact, tomorrow is really dedicated to thinking both conceptually and practically about the organisation of that exhibition and the role of research within it. But today we're going to be really reporting back on our trip to Shanton and Caton. Not every member of the network has been able to get to every meeting. And some members of the network are going to be moving in and out of the meeting today because they've got other things to do. So it's quite open. And so in a sense what we're doing is reporting back.
Yeah.
Grant, over to you. We'll now, so Grant and I are just going to, through conversation, try and feed back a little bit on ideas of Shanton.
Yeah, I think you sort of covered everything.
Okay, so just go back.
But I think, I mean, maybe the one thing I was thinking about initially was just this question of ambiguity around Tagore. And in the first meeting, we all kind of made this kind of disclaimer of how we all felt ambiguous about Tagore and his legacy, and what Andrea says about the fact that his reception in Europe was kind of so much about adulation and exoticism and projection, and that we wanted to distance ourselves from that. But what I find really interesting about Tagore is that, notwithstanding all those problems, and this is, I think, now leading to the experience of the trip and other trips that I've made to India, is that when you test those problems out against Indian intellectuals on the left, they don't dismiss Tagore. They definitely, I mean, I'm not speaking in a comprehensive way here, I'm just saying that some of the people I've engaged in conversation with, and some of the people that we spoke in depth to in Shanton and Caton, like, for example, Anshuman, who I would say is coming from a kind of left position, but is very invested in exploring Tagore as a figure in a very meticulous way, actually. And what was very nice about our engagement with Anshuman, I think would agree that people who went on the trip, is that he knows the kind of very precise detail Tagore. So when we generalise wildly about Tagore, he says, no, actually, I looked through those papers in the Kalabavad archive, and there is a thing there which says that, you know, Shantificatum, Santahal village was established at this time or whatever. So I think that for me that was really interesting once again to kind of test out this figure of Tagore, you know, the question of his elitism, the fact that he came from this aristocratic background, the fact that he was so kind of caught up in things that we would perhaps not want to acknowledge, such as a kind of, you know, spiritual approach to his thinking around art, culture, politics, etc. But nevertheless, there is a side to Tagore which one can sort of somehow, I mean, there was something very radical about him, I think. You know, there was something very profoundly radical about what he was proposing.
No, I agree. And actually, this morning I was reading this lecture he did in 1919 about the title of the lecture. The title of the lecture is The Centre of Indian Culture, and it was the first lecture he did in India. He did this lecture in Madras, and it's the first lecture he did in English. And actually, what's very interesting about it, and in a way, this is, I think this is my understanding of his radicalism, is the way in which he very clearly at this point, and this is the point in Tagore's life at which, what I understand, he is still very dedicated to the idea of developing an Indian nationalism in opposition to the colonial power, the English colonial power that was clearly regulating the framework of everything in India, including education. And this lecture is about universities, and it talks very clearly about how a new national framework for universities in India needs to be set up in opposition to and he talks very funnily about the Oxford and Cambridge model, the imported model, you know, and he talks about how, and he's actually very rude about Indian pedagogues, you know, and he says that we've got to, you know, we've got to pull our socks up, this is terrible, we're just copying the import model and we need to change that very radically. And he draws parallels with, and he talks about the Irish education system, and he says that that the English colonisers of Ireland wiped out and actually literally destroyed the buildings of Irish university education or further education, Irish pedagogy, and replaced it with the English model. And so Tagore draws parallels between the fight for independence in Ireland, and remember this is 1919, so this is an extraordinary moment also in Ireland. This is the beginning of, well, it's not the beginning of the Troubles, but it's a kind of moment of the Troubles, 1919 being particularly important in that history. And he draws parallels with that. And of course, this is at the moment where he's also very involved in, the Swadeshi movement, the idea of Indian home rule, effectively, and home rule is also a term that was used in Ireland at the time. But then he makes this move, and he makes this move towards what we picked up on, and we picked up on this through Rustum, the idea of no nation, which it captured us, didn't it?
Yeah, I think that was really important. I mean, we did this we had this great 2-day session with Rustum. One day, which was kind of, because we had this group of DIE students, including you, and one day was kind of in a way dedicated to sort of dealing with the concerns brought up by the students and your practices. And he found a very interesting way of kind of weaving in Tagore and Shantificatum into those conversations. And the second day was much more sort of unpacking his book and Another Asia. And a part of that was kind of looking at this vocabulary, the term cosmopolitanism, which I think we discussed in our last session, but you know, as Andrea says, a term which kind of comes in and out of favour, and the term that he kind of proposed was cosmopolitics, which was kind of, in a way, taking this individual figure out of the equation, because cosmopolitanism is so coloured by the notion of these kind of figures that sort of flit around the world and are able to deal with sort of cultural translation, cultural transition. Universalism as a term, universal humanism as a term, which seemed kind of inaccessible, although we did discuss that. But then, you know, no nation was the term which Tagore, I think, puts forward as something as something quite radical and something quite complicated. I think on one level it's quite complicated because people make the argument that the nation is necessary in a kind of post-colonial context in order to protect, certain interests from transnational capitalism, for example. But I think that the interesting thing about Tagore is that he had this very anti-institutional way of thinking. And for him, the institution at the time was the colonial structure. And his idea was that decolonization would be about radically rethinking everything. So it wouldn't be about kind of setting up an equivalent of a European national structure in India. It would be, we don't want that at all. That doesn't apply to India. We have other structures. So he talks about, for example, Samaj, this notion of community, which might be like something more like a kind of anarchistic notion of organization. And the other thing was this thing that he says about no curriculum in relation to education, which we debated, and Angelique had some kind of questions about that, issues about that. No curriculum.
Come back to that, 'cause I think it's
No
curriculum.
Yeah. But it seemed to me that there's this kind of interesting dichotomy in Tagore. On the one hand, you have this kind of very anti-institutional stance. On the other hand, you have someone who, it's very idealistic in a way that you might say, well, how the hell are we going to then bring that into being? But then on the other hand, he does set up these two organisations, Shantiniketan and Sriniketan, where he tries to figure out how those things can work in reality.
And the kind of pedagogic model of Shantiniketan, as well as the agrarian model in Sriniketan, it kind of follows this Samaj principle.
Yeah.
It seems to me, so that I was also kind of trying to find, kind of detailed descriptions of what the model of education was at Shantiniketan, and in a way it's kind of really related to many of the utopian schools that was being set up in Europe at the time as well. So kids will be allowed to learn in their own language and then climb trees, and then they also have to take, I think the important thing about them, which I think maybe was missing in a way from the European models, I mean there are many people in this room that kind of went to the kind of grandchildren of those models as educational, to educate, to be educated themselves, including you and I.
Yeah.
But what was clear in the Shantiniketan model, this idea of the kind of forest school, maybe we'll come back up this afternoon with Bendelin, is a kind of self-responsibility, a kind of learning to be a responsible social citizen, which in my mind was kind of missing from the other ones. But I wanted to go back to this idea of no nation, because we talked about it lots. One of the things that we did at the end of our trip to Shantiniketan was on the last night, so Wendelin, Angelica, myself, Grant, and Anshuman, and Anshuman's wife, who I forgot the name of. Mandira, thank you. And we all got together and we talked. We just kind of tried to summarise what we'd learned and what we'd learned really. It really was very much a learning process. And we kind of reviewed things, and we were really taken up by these two terms, no nation and cosmopolitics, and we thought, how can we use them? So I went back to Rustum to see where this idea of no nation came up, because I couldn't remember effectively. And it was interesting that in this, it comes up in, I think, the most interesting book the interesting chapter in Another Asia, which was Rustum's book on Tagore and Okakura, who was a Japanese artist who was, by the end of the 19th century, already embedded in Boston as a curator, actually. So he was a curator of Asian collections, and this is a moment at which many European collectors are mining Asia for its historical artifacts. And Tagore, he meets Tagore in India and then invites Tagore to go to Japan. And at this point, Tagore goes to Japan in around 1916 again, so in the very beginning of the 20th century, at a moment which, of course, in kind of geopolitics is very precarious. This is in the middle of the First World War. And he makes a series of really radical lectures where he says to them, and this is a Japan that is shoring itself up nationally. You know, it's a series of really radical lectures at which he says, you need to forget nationalism, otherwise you are really in trouble. You're not only in trouble for yourselves, but you're in trouble, you know, kind of internationally. It's not really and it didn't make him very friends. And he said, and this is a rather famous moment in Tagore, he says at this point, but I'm just a poet, you know. So he kind of delivers these lectures like all over Japan, and then he goes, but I'm just a poet, you know. And he talks about kind of poets' politics quite a lot at that point. So I was interested, this concept of no nation emerges at that point. That's when he starts talking. That's the moment at which no nation comes up. So it's actually really embedded kind of in this very particular political moment.
Yeah, I think it was this sort of admiration that Tagore had for Japanese culture in Japan, and I think many people had, because it was the nation which hadn't been colonized, it had developed in a particular way, it was able to stand up to the West. And I think it was this huge disappointment that actually it was taking on. And there was a very nice, either in the book or something that Rustin said, where he criticizes his Japanese hosts for their reception of him and the way that it reflects the way that he's received in the West. So he makes this kind of interesting triangulation that says, you know, this kind of imitation of the West is like, it's a kind of, you know, there's nowhere to go with that. And but I think what was really interesting for me in the Shantung trip and sort of post that was kind of thinking about what is the function of the group. For me, I mean, obviously it seems that everybody has their own route through it. But for me, it was really kind of coming back to this question of institutional politics and how one can sort of survive in the world with a particular kind of mode of thinking, you know, because I think that the institutional frameworks that are developed and that we inhabit are kind of about survival and about certain kinds of productivity and success. And I think that, you know, I think the Shantung model, I mean, I don't know if it still exists in this way, but the concept that Tagore had was something very anti-bureaucratic, anti-professional, anti-commercial, all the things which are sort of, in a way, now given as are a sort of given model that we can't escape. And it's also really interesting to hear these stories about how Tagore, in a way, lost power within his own organisation. He gave up power, and what happened was that it became increasingly bureaucratized as an institution. He was outvoted by his board, who wanted to bureaucratize the organisation.
And this was specifically around the idea of the curriculum. So
and the awarding of a degree. So this moment, we talked about it a lot on the last evening, and it had come up throughout. It came up in a fantastic lecture that Shiv Kumar gave to us, which unfortunately, because I was in charge of the technology that day, I failed completely to... But maybe he has a paper, actually.
I know, I've asked him for it, and what I also would really love would be his PowerPoint presentation, but then that way lies lots of copyright issues.
But I think definitely the paper.
No, lovely.
Yes,
it's very similar actually to the paper that you circulated to the group, I think, as well, earlier on, Shiv Kumar's paper. So maybe, but this moment, just to kind of dwell on this for a little bit, because in a way I think this is where we are, metaphorically or almost allegorically, or in parallel, should I say, rather than allegorically, this is where we are with this question of institutions. Which is, so Tagore supports this this moment of giving up, of moving away, of giving away power. And of course there's many arguments which is Tagore can afford to give away power. And actually Antonin said that to us at the time. You know, don't be romantic. But in this voting system, what is also very interesting, because it was, as Grant says, a vote about whether they should bureaucratise the university, so the development of Visibarata. But the four people that supported Tagore were three European people that had worked with him and his biographer. And the six that voted against him were his employees. That were his Indian employees. So there's this kind of fantastic relationship set up. And he gives himself up to this, so he doesn't kind of come in and say, no, it's my university. I'm gonna demand that you do it my way, kind of thing. And then we talk quite a lot with Antonin about the fact that now, in a way, the university is regulated in the same way as all the universities then Angelique brought up this kind of interesting question, I think. I'm going to come back to this institutional thing, about how there are many places that are setting up kind of radical art schools, artist-led art schools in the world right now. I mean, there's a local one which is open, it's called East, but I think we also were talking about Wells Shawkey's school in Alexandria. I can't remember, Angela, the ones that you mentioned.
I was talking about
the Palestinian school and the Jenin school.
A difference between Jenin and these schools which are operating within the art world, contemporary art world, as sites, spaces that appear as if they are doing something for the local community. And Fiesta Gates is
Exactly.
ideas of whether they are actually or not is complex.
Yeah.
They are. He doesn't have a school Fiesta, but definitely this Shawkey school and the Alexandria
School East.
and this School East, and then this school in Palestine, Ramallah. How can we dare criticise those places? Because these are set up by well-meaning people. So, but what I found when I was there was that these students there's no curriculum. There's absolutely no sense of a curriculum. There's no political agenda. So they are just being all these fancy art. People go there to kind of make themselves look better because they've been there, but actually very little goes into the kind of students and their BAs, and they have no kind of way of measuring themselves against the contemporary art world except through these stars. And they're not really taught. I found it very complicated. For me, it's a very complicated.
But I think it's important because it's the other side of this question of curriculum, no curriculum, and obviously Adrian is also historically has
well, I think the thing is what people don't understand is staying up a lot of summit in Berlin, is that not having a curriculum is the most difficult thing. It's by far, it takes more work than anything else. And what you're saying in these three categories, that people say we don't have a curriculum, they leave it at that as if it's practical. And the other problem is that art education is inherently deeply conservative. And if one tries to have a radical art school, it's always a mistake.
But it's more interesting.
You won't have radical art school, you have to do conservative one.
But just to bring it back to the idea of the institution, I think the reason we were interested in this kind of this paradox or contradiction between curriculum and no curriculum, as it emerged in our conversations about Tagore at Shantiniketan, which is with the boys climbing the trees and then girls climbing the trees, or then girls coming in and dancing actually, dance schools. So this kind of utopian fantasy of education that is learning through the material artistic exploration, creativity at the heart of everything. And of course, we know how this language has been completely neoliberalised now, as you said. But there was something about this paradox which brings us back to how things are instituted, how things might be differently instituted here in a sense.
I think one of the important points that came up was the idea that Shantiniketan wasn't a model. It couldn't be a model. You can't transpose it from one place to another. And that was Tagore's point. It's like this idea of Samaj is that you just have. My understanding is that you have a kind of a scenario, you have a group of people, you have a context, and then you figure out something for that situation. And so in a sense, it's not that one would kind of look at, Shantiniketan as a model that one can then apply, say, okay, no curriculum there, no curriculum here. But it did provoked a lot of interesting thoughts about this relationship between structure and no structure, the survival of certain kinds of ways of being and operating within a world that's hostile to those. And I think that's kind of, in a way, what Tagore attempted. And he could do it because of his privilege, but he did attempt to kind of, in a way, like, have a certain way of being in the world that wasn't conducive to the structures of colonialism. And so I think that's interesting as a point. But I took on board completely Angelica's critique about how, it's really important that people learn certain things in order to empower themselves. But then I was talking, for example, to Stuart Brisley recently about his working at his teaching at the Slade and how there was no curriculum. I mean, you probably know this really well, Adrian. There was no curriculum, but the students would come and they would make a curriculum.
Yeah.
themselves. They would invite the tutors. They would organise their seminars. So it's about how do you kind of, you know, it's not that you don't learn things, it's about how do you actually kind of, you know, decide what is going to be learnt in any given
So
situation.
the ground also that's based around because it was seeing students practice at that time
Yeah,
as well. So there's a spectacle which you like, it's the core of the curriculum.
yeah,
And then maybe that's something to do with Tagore.
yeah, it's true.
What
Yes.
you're saying to us that leads us
Yeah,
to necessarily becoming a spectacle despite
Yes.
himself.
Yeah.
In
Yes.
order for the other things to evolve.
That's
Yeah.
interesting, and that actually might be interesting in relationship to some of your research, Anne, as well. The kind of the kind of the self-presentation of that.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, whether or not Tagore understood that was a kind of conscious or, you know, kind of contextual position. But the other thing that we did at Shanton Caton, on a very practical basis, it might be useful for people to know, is that we spent a lot of time walking around the campus. Iona was there as well. So these kind of amazing moments where we're walking around the campus and stopping in front of the murals. So the campus has amazing murals, beautiful sculptural works, and we stopped in front of them and we talked about them. We talked in detail about them, and they're these amazing historical kind of moments of Indian modernism, and we will play some of the clips of that later on. But then also, and I just wondered whether it's worth kind of bringing this up and then finishing there, is we also went to the Santal Museum as well.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
And also, not only the Santal Museum, but the Santal Informal School. So the informal school that was set up. Unfortunately, it was a holiday, so there weren't any kids there. But
Yeah, I mean, well, I suppose it's interesting in terms of the relationship between the sort of Tagore's community and the Santal tribal people. I mean, I think they were kind of valorized by Tagore and that group in the sense that they hadn't been, I mean, there was this kind of maybe romantic notion they hadn't been corrupted by colonialism, they still had this kind of culture. And also that they were actively involved in insurgent movements against the British.
Yeah.
And that also, I think...
And repressed as well.
And they were exactly, they were marginalised. And I mean, I think that that's also in relation to modernist art practice, the way that the kind of notion of primitivism emerged at Shanton Caton through the sort of figure of the Santal is very different from a kind of Parisian notion where you have this sort of mask coming from somewhere else and you have no relationship whatsoever. So there was an attempt at Shanton Caton to build a relationship with the Santal community. And so, for example, you have Santali students at the art college, and one of the graduates from that course has helped to make this museum of Santali culture, which was really interesting.
It's a beautiful museum.
And work in the school, which
Yeah.
is also really interesting.
And also there's a kind of, at Srinacaton also, there were Santal people working there and developing products there as well.
Did you talk, I mean, I think try to take everything more seriously since last time.
Thank you.
Because we started off a bit flippantly with denials. Well, not flippant,
It was disclaimer.
We were just
protecting ourselves.
Cross that
Yeah.
Did you, in talking about human education, this nation, no nation, did anyone talk about this point, which seems to be important now from the stuff I read, the point in which he teaches in the self-done version script? Because that seems to be kind of it's a kind of prediction of the horrors of partition. And suddenly these things you have to fight to know.
You mean that he explored this kind of Muslim
You
heritage?
go from left to right and right to left.
Yeah.
That's as simple as that.
That's interesting. It relates back to some of the things you were talking about earlier
but
on.
also to what you just talked about, relates about this no nation.
Yeah.
Because
I mean,
after partition is
Of course.
but we talked about it more in terms of his clothing. So in terms of this kind of like the way that he, in his clothes, he had this kind of combination of the sort of Muslim and Hindu traditions, as well as Japanese influences. So he kind of, he was, I mean, and of course in his novels and his writing, he was, like for example in Home in the World, there's like a very strong statement against communalism and these tensions between Hindu and Muslim. But I don't think it's
No, we didn't talk about that. And I've just been reading this book by Catherine O'Connell called Tagore the Poet as Educator, and she mentions it a little bit, so I'm learning a little bit about this. but I mean, apart from the fact that I think you can see it in a funny kind of way that might emerge in some of the ways he doctored his writing, you know, so visually. But I know that this question of like the way that language was taught within the schools was very, very important, and that Tagore, I mean, it's not exactly what we're saying about the kind of moving backwards and forwards and learning a different scriptural language, a different scriptural history. Yeah. But it's but it also emerged. I think it emerges also in this idea that languages, that people should learn languages. He talks a lot, and he talks in this lecture that I just mentioned, the 1916 lecture, about how Indians know no languages, and you know, and he wants to go back to understanding the complexity of languages in India. So I don't know how. I mean, but that's a kind of much more. That's the kind of lecture he's giving. So it's kind of, it's much more. I mean, that's a strategic lecture. Yeah, it's a lecture that he's giving to a group of the kind of top educators in India, and he's trying to kind of provoke them. But I don't know so much about that. It might be interesting to find
I
out.
suspect it's an interesting problem for us in terms of whether we all accept we all speak English to each other, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Olive, just let me, do you have anything to comment?
No.
Because you were there, you were there for that whole Iona.
No, I mean, if it's okay, I mean, all the, I don't know, honestly. I mean, this is all what I've been thinking about too, but then I really keep thinking about how this angle of what I want to present this afternoon as well, kind of a beginning of a thought of some, I don't know, parallels or putting things next to each other of what I had already learned about, let's say, educational reform in Indonesia around the same time, and beginnings of alternative and thoughts of independence and alternative ways of getting there. I just try to reflect on how that fits, you know, what else can be questioned and how it fits to other things actually. So I'm not sure if I have anything to add as well. Sorry.
That's right. I just wonder, there's a short paragraph here from Rustam's book called Reclaiming Cosmopolitanism. Right. I just thought it might be nice to read it out, because it's one of the things, I think Rustam was an incredibly generous member of our research group. He's coming in June to do lectures, and hopefully we'll come to those. But he also has this kind of way of using Tagore to kind of rethink in I think ways that we all found really inspiring. So because it goes back to this idea of cosmopolitics, again, I was just looking for the roots of the words that we've been, you know, to try and kind of work out, to remind myself where he placed them exactly. And I think it's really relevant. So this is again in Another Asia, in his chapter on cosmopolitanism, and the subheading is Reclaiming Cosmopolitanism, and he says, so it's a kind of half-page paragraph. Against the onslaught of new nationalisms and the upsurge of xenophobia in increasingly deceptive and virulent ways, a need to reclaim cosmopolitanism in the age of globalization has emerged in different disciplines and from a spectrum of philosophical directions. And this is Rustam moving on from Tagore in a sense, rather than directly related to Tagore. Mediated through multiculturalism, a term that came up yesterday in the talk that Kojo and John Comfort did about the Stuart Hall Unfinished Conversation project. Mediated through multiculturalism and diasporic studies, there is a clear shift away from the classical origins of cosmopolitanism in Stoic philosophy and its Eurocentrist legacy, affirming citizens of the world, in quotes, who constituted and are still imagined to constitute one worldwide community of human beings. He puts that in quotes. So against that, he's saying that we need to think against that. Despite some continuing philosophical adherence to such dated and unilateral constructions, there is a more robust questioning whether apparent universals such as cosmopolitanism can ever be extricated from the vested interests of specific national and transnational contexts. It is now more widely accepted that all universals grounded in the particularities of the history in which they are imbricated and from which constructions of the universal are invented more often than not to perpetuate the vested interests and consumerist needs of specific constituencies. Far from being detached, free-floating citizens in the world, today's cosmopolitans are rooted in agendas where national and global forces intersect in a mutating cosmopolitical field of economic, social and political forces. And I think it's that kind of shift that Rustum makes for us from the cosmopolitan to cosmopolitics that is interesting for us to think about in relationship to the institution of art, in a sense, or instituting art into it.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Anything else that we need to... Have we told you what happened at Shanton Caton? It feels like we've... Yeah, so we went there. Oh, well, the other thing that we did, which I've forgotten about... No, I just know there was just one thing to say, is that the other thing we did in Kolkata is we went to Jaroshevsky, we went to his amazing house, where, so I think there was this incredible, I mean, you know, I'm being... I've never been to Kolkata before, I've never been to Shantiniketan before, so this was like, I've been to India before, so this was like a kind of amazing thing for me, to go to this beautiful house, which of course to me was the set of Sajid Ray's film, The Home in the World. I felt like I'd just stepped into a film set, and it is very beautiful, and it's completely redolent with privilege, and it has this beautiful kind of Portuguese kind of model of building, a kind of beautiful balcony, a central courtyard, lots of cool rooms going off it. And the other thing we did was we went to, in Shantiniketan, we went to the kind of museum of Tagore's houses as well. And that was rather amazing.
There's
so these
6 houses.
Yeah. And they're all built in different places, and he kind of moved from one to one. And there's one that was built out of mud that we couldn't go into because it was built out of collapse. And so they hadn't really thought about the roof properly, you know. So, but they were extraordinary.
What seems to be really important about what you tell us is you're walking around and looking and talking.
Completely.
And if we must have time to look at some of that, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, we have Anshuman's recording. He was guiding us.
Yeah, and then that seems almost like the most important thing in a way.
Yeah. It was amazing, absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And the one thing that Shanae asked me this, and I suddenly realised I forgot. I don't remember if we did. Did we see the chair that Victoria Ocampo gave to Tagore?
We might have done.
I know, but that's not good enough for Shanae.
No, there was one room, there was one house that was furnished.
Did we see?
Because the others are not furnished. There's one that's furnished, there's a lot of furniture in there. And I suspect that ask Anshuman, he'll know immediately.
The chair would be somewhere.
Is the chair there?
The chair. It's supposed to be like a kind of a lounge chair where he was sitting and he kind of...
In which part of his life is that?
When he was coming back from Argentina, where he spent time with Victoria Ocampo, and she gifted it to him for the journey back, and because the chair was so big, he had to take the doors off on the ship to get the chair in and then reinstall the doors. And he claims that when he was sitting in that chair on the journey back, he read Baudelaire and really understood what Baudelaire was saying. And so there's I think the chair symbolizes a whole other kind of system of exchange, network, privilege, and beyond it just being interesting, the journey of the object.
Exactly. And I felt dreadfully ashamed that, because we talked about it in our last workshop, so it was like such a kind of iconic image, and then we've just kind of drifted past it and forgot to look.
I think she wants to get him off the floor as well.
Probably.
I think there's quite a lot of things she wants to do to him, allegedly, but then there you go.
But
He wasn't sitting on
Question unrelated to the chair, just going back to the Santo Family Museum.
Just
Just from a very specific point of view, what was the way the display was organized? Was it using tropes of the ethnographic, or was it kind of undercutting them in any way?
It was very ethnographic.
But that was very nice.
Yeah.
It was very anecdotally, so...
Okay,
yeah,
because
it
it's
was
so
very
because
much-
the prevalence
They
of
didn't know it was
ethnographic presentation in Indian museums still to this day. Like there was a show in Bombay in December which was on the Parsi community, and it was this show text, and it was a blatantly ethnographic show in a modern art museum, and there was no questioning of the strategy of presenting a minority community through those curatorial strategies, and so it would be very interesting to see how the Santal Museum, I know this is completely unrelated.
No, it's not unrelated. I think we should. I think it's interesting.
But it is very interesting that the Santal Museum is like a hut. I mean, it's not a
With a
hut, it's like a
garden.
really, but it's very, very informal. You go upstairs and then there's this room in which indeed there is an attempt to make this kind of display, but at the same time it's completely like...
It's quite elegant, I think.
It's
Rather
elegant, but then it's
low-key.
really anecdotal and
Yeah.
completely like the little bits of something
It's
that you
got
can then
medicines and
touch
plants
and
and-
exactly, and completely not...
I don't think
It's not posturing, positioning,
No,
totalizing.
No. It's and then there's like a musical instrument made by an uncle of an uncle, and it's like a very
That's-
familiar thing. And
So
photographs, sort of something.
It's not like when Rajiv Sethi did that show in 1982.
Yeah, I'm very
Market,
curious to think
where he brought people from India, craftspeople, to sit in the gallery and make make stuff. This was absolutely vile.
Because it's also made by
It's not
someone.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like
it's a very interesting
self-presentation.
thing to fit,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
those tones. And
Yeah.
also, if, as you're saying, it's anecdotal, so where, if there was an awareness of how they were being read within a Santini Cajun context, where I guess what they represented, as you said, the discussion of primitivism that came to the fore in Santini through the Santals, is that kind of engagement. But from what you're saying, the museum doesn't really operate on those tones.
It's not conceptualized in
Yeah.
that way. It's like rather precise collections of musical instruments,
Objects.
medicines, drums,
Some
fishing
jewelry,
nets,
yeah,
really
fishing
nice,
nets,
medicine.
jewelry,
Yeah, all
and
sorts of
photographs.
things, yeah.
If I remember
Very
rightly, we
small.
also spent
Like
a long
a
time
magic
talking
with a
with
beautiful-
Anshuman and
It's
the
not on the
artist.
campus.
Okay.
Alright.
Yeah.
Somewhere near a village, example village.
We spent a long time talking about marriage ceremonies, if I remember rightly.
Because
Because
you
they
can divorce each other.
Yeah.
Marriage is
yeah.
flexible. in
Really
some
flexible,
culture.
really
Yeah.
interesting.
The idealistic
Yeah.
society.
And what about this notion of the enemy, the outsider that Anshuman
Yes.
was mentioning? That was really interesting.
That was really
Because
interesting.
Anshuman is a long-term visitor of some. Actually, had a family member, a friend that married into the Santal
Yeah.
community, and that was like when somebody marries into it from outside, it was slowly accepted. And but then he said he would always be addressed with a word that I forgot.
Actually,
What was it?
it's translated to mean exploiter.
Yeah, but all of the things. It
Yeah.
translates to
Enemy.
outsider, enemy, and exploiter.
Yeah.
But it was a very short word.
And it applied to both Europeans and
Yeah.
mainstream
Yeah.
Indians. It was
Indians
like,
or people from Bengal. It was everything.
And you always remain that. So Anshuman
Yeah.
is always that, even though he has family relations.
Yeah,
And there's a
it's
kind
very
of
good friends.
there's a kind of placing of people in a sense. It's interesting. Yeah, it's great.
But the other, just one thing,
Yeah.
the other thing that came up in our discussion with Dustin, I thought was really interesting, was Gandhi, like, this discussion of Gandhi, and it also came up in Stockholm, in our conference with you,
Yeah.
Gandhi. And it made me think, oh, maybe I would like to explore this more.
Was there a discussion, like now that you're talking about Gandhi and something just related to my research, is the position of Tagore again amidst another network of South Asian men who were cosmopolitan at that time, who were inhabiting the world? Did that come up rather than, because there is the relation to men like Okura from Japan and
Yeah.
counterparts in the West, but because there were other, Gandhi being an example, maybe a little later, let's say Umrao Singh Sehgal, Amrita Sehgal's father, who around the late 1800s, early 1900s, was another privileged cosmopolitan figure, self-fashioning in Paris, Budapest. Did that discussion come up of reading Tagore in relation to his pure community from South Asia,
It did,
inhabiting the world?
it did a bit in terms of Gandhi, but really in terms of sort of this kind of this idea of the kind of semiotics of Gandhi, the semiotics of Tagore.
But not because you have Mulkraj Anand,
No,
you have
didn't go
all
into
those
that
kinds of
wider
figures,
field.
and how does
No.
Tagore kind of relate in relation? I mean, how is he positioned in relation to them? Like someone like Mulkraj Anand,
No.
him being here and then him going back, starting Marg, and the relationship to architecture and questions of hygiene and displacing caste. So that's because I think that's another point of engagement for me, which is interesting, is to read Tagore within that kind of peer group from
Yeah.
that time, rather than
This
hold
might-
him to being the singular figure inhabiting the world.
No, we didn't. I'm afraid we did hold him as a rather singular figure in a sense. But this might come up in relationship to talking about the exhibition tomorrow and your contribution to it. The three men that were talked about were the three white men, the three European men. So Andrews, Elmhurst, and I always forget the name of the last one. Sturgeon? No.
Rosenstein?
No. Never come back.
These are the ones that voted alongside.
They're the ones that voted alongside Tagore, and they are the ones that work for him. And and there are very beautiful photographs of them posing with him or on their own and all those kind of things. But they're not. But they are European.
And
And
Gandhi.
Gandhi.
And Gandhi, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I just ordered this book, the lectures or the letters between Gandhi and Tagore,
Yes.
but it hasn't arrived in time.
Yeah.
Got lost in the post station.
And the other thing,
The post office. It
You have to
might
get
be at the post
Anna to
office.
invent it for you.
Anna will rewrite it for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
They promised
By
to
hand.
send it.
the other thing that you brought up when you was also I think you all discussed is the queering of Tagore or the
Yeah.
relationship
Yeah.
of
The
Tagore
queering
to
of Tagore, we talked
queering,
about a lot.
yeah, and
With
With
Rustum.
Rustum.
That's Rustum's
Yeah.
main idea,
Yeah.
main interest in a sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And what did that
yeah,
mean?
but you shares.
So for him, the queering is through this research process that we've talked about, which is a rereading of Tagore as through these particular ideas of cosmopolitics and no-nationism that he brings up. So that, for Rustum, I think, is a queering. But of course, it's also to read him against the grain of the Indian mainstream kind of the positioning of him as a universal nationalist or a national universalist in the sense that that's how he's positioned. So the queering for Rustum is very much that. It's very much reading him as a subversive figure and a figure that can be recuperated for contemporary thought. So in that sense, that's what Rustum is understanding the
Because
queering as.
because he's become normalised as a figure
Yeah.
in some ways, and that this kind of queer aspect of Tagore, not in kind of terms of sexuality, but just in terms of his kind of his strange affect, that this could be somehow recaptured.
Yeah, but I think it's also for Rustum and for many of, I think the idea of sexuality being somewhere around that construction, not to say that, that
he said that wasn't the interesting point.
no.
That it didn't matter whether he had these
But
kind
that's
of
also helped.
thoughts.
No, but there is a kind of homoeroticism occasionally in the writing,
Yeah.
and also Rustum is thinking through those things more generally.
Yeah.
That's his project.
Yeah.
effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there something in that sartorial composition as well, bringing together different elements of dress and fashioning and masculinity that's also queer, and
Yeah.
being aware of
Indeed.
playing presence and
He
sartorial.
was effeminate in a way. He had a very effeminate voice.
Mm.
He had this kind of particular way of dressing. And apparently his walk was kind of also rather effeminate. That's what Rustum said. And maybe that comes across in your in that film clip that you
In
showed last
the
time.
shuffle.
Yeah, which is now on the website actually. Yeah, well, so YouTube, you can get it on YouTube. Can't you? So yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So we can see it. I mean, when we finish the website. Yeah, absolutely.